Om. 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 Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Samasta Janakalyane Niratam Karunamayam Namami Chinmayam Devam Satgurum Brahmavidvaram. So Hari Om, everyone. And we're continuing now our series on Hinduism. And 2 weeks ago when we met, we spoke about the Vedas. And we spoke about the Vedas as a body of knowledge. And if we really want to see what is the foundation of Hinduism, it is the Veda. Specifically, what in the Veda? We saw it was the Upanishad. And last time also, we saw the different sections of the Veda and what each of them meant. Now, for a Hindu, when we look at our three main scriptures, which are called Prasthanatraya, the first one is called Upanishad, the second is the Bhagavad Gita, and the third one is the Brahma Sutras. What happens is, when we're presented with these scriptures, sometimes it's hard for us to grasp and understand them just by reading them. So our Rishi said, why not bring out the life of the scriptures? In the scriptures, it will tell us, lead a good life, follow dharma, think about the benefit of totality, think about how everyone can grow together. It will give us these words. But the rishis realized we also need to see these come to life. And so therefore, they brought out what we call our itihasas. Itihasa means, thus it happened. So itihasa means our historical textbooks that dramatize the message of the Vedas. So number one, they are history. Number two, they dramatize that which is found in the Veda. So we will see shortly, Akash will show us a beautiful verse that says these historical books talk about dharma, or duty, artha, wealth, kama, desire, and moksha, liberation. It talks about the pursuit of these things. And these two itihasas, which we are specifically going to look into today, are Ramayana and Mahabharata. Before going into whether they are real or whether they are not, and all these questions that we have, I just want to give you a little bit of a background. Number one is, whenever we study our own Shastra or scriptures, it's important that we study it in the original text. So there are many things online. We know there are many things from many versions, many things written online, many people's blogs, from where we can find information about Ramayana and Mahabharata. But if we want to know the truth in those scriptures, we must study them in their original context, in their original text, as they were written. The second is, if we sincerely want to study these texts, they must be studied under a guru parampara, under a lineage of teachers. It's like even a simple thing, an example I gave to our teachers, even a simple thing like martial arts, right? Imagine if you studied martial arts in a lineage of teachers who taught, like in Kung Fu Panda, right? Versus somebody who's just kind of learned it and read about it. There's a huge difference. because that teacher takes on the whole tradition when they teach. Not only that, but when we study with a Guru Parampara, they know the whole context of the scripture. Because sometimes one verse can be pulled out and misinterpreted, and another verse will be pulled out and misinterpreted. And we've seen so many things like this happen. But when we study under a guru, there is a system, and that guru has the knowledge of that entire Shastra. So we really are able to see it clearly. The third thing I want to mention is that our history is written by a very pure mind. So if we see Valmiki Rishi, how he started Ramayana is that he was very curious, and he asks Narad Rishi, is there a person, is there a being who lives these values that we always talk about? This life of dharma, this life of austerity. Is there somebody who embodies this? Who is that? And so he comes from a very pure mind. Same with how Mahabharata was written. The Mahabharata was written because they wanted to know about the Kuru dynasty. So it wasn't with a mind that wants to make people think a certain way, or because people want to rule over a certain territory, or colonize it, or change their belief systems. It wasn't written with that kind of intention, which sometimes history is written under that kind of intention or that kind of mindset. So it's written from a place of purity. The fourth point I want to make is that this history is not written as prose all the time. It's written in a very poetical form. So you'll see the verses in Mahabharata, the verses in Ramayana, they're in a particular poetical meter or chanda. Some of them are written like that, so that they're able to also draw our attention, because what's the point of having all of these verses and us not reading it? So our history is written in a different way, in poetry. Our history is written with a very different intention. It is really for enlightenment. It is written out of a very pure mind. And therefore, it may appear to be something that's just a story, but in actuality, it is history, but just written in a different way, with a different intention from a different tradition. So today we're going to explore how Ramayana and Mahabharata can be seen as history. And so now I will pass it on to Akash, and he'll share with us some thoughts. And after that, we can all discuss together. Okay.
Hari Om. So generally, like this question of Ramayana and Mahabharata being a myth or history or itihasa, that comes to us, that may come to us, that may come to our children, and those times, it sometimes becomes very hard for them to explain. Like, is it actually just a story, or it it did actually happen? And to do this, to do justice with this question, we should also be aware of some research which is going on in this direction. And if we are aware of this research that's happening in this direction, we would be able to have a good and informed response. And the purpose of this presentation would be to give us some pointers in which direction to look and research, and we can do our own deeper research, because this slide is not at all exhaustive. It is just a pointers which will point towards different researches happening in this subject. And all the things that we present in this slides are just a collection of different research done by different like scholars. So it's all credit to them that we were able to get this kind of information. So let's first start with what Shumarji was saying. about what is itihasa and why it's little different from history. Because the way we understand history is like a historical record in kind of prose, like starting from dating, like at this date this happened, at that date that happened, so on and so forth. But that's the purpose of history. But itihasa has a different purpose. So here the shlok basically reads, Dharmartha kama mokshanam updesha samanvitam purvavrittam katha yuktam itihasam prachakshate, which basically says that first line gives the objective of history. First line is dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. It gives us updesh. Updesh as in advises us on how to live a life which is full, where we can fulfill all the four purusharthas. Purushartha means these four purusharthas of dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. And then the second line says that purva vrittam, it happened before, purva vrittam, katha yuktam, it is said in a poetic or a story format, itihasam, that is called itihasa, prachakshate. And this definition we will see in any, like if we see, look up any Sanskrit online dictionary, or it will always accompany the standard itihas definition of it. It is how it happened. That's the standard definition. Along with this quotation will also be there. So this is a beautiful quotation because it gives us first the objective of itihasa, how should we read it and what should we take away from the itihas, and second, what does it represent, like how the writers of these itihas, great scriptures like Ved Vyas ji and Valmiki ji, what did they thought about when they were writing. So first is the objective is to give us the advice on how to live a dharmic life. And since we all have born and we are not perfect, we have to go through all the four purusharthas to reach the perfection of moksha. And to guide us on this path, Sage Valmiki ji and Ved Vyas ji has written these great scriptures, because this gives us a like real life application of the theories that we like the philosophical knowledge that we have in our Advaita Vedanta, and that becomes very useful for us when we are dealing with our own life scenarios and situations. And the second line basically says that Purva Vrittam, it happened before. It's not like it's just a figment, it's just imagination of Ved Vyas ji or Valmiki ji. It happened before, and it is in the story format. And that is itihas. So it's a very interesting thing to see. Like generally, whenever there is some scholarly work like this, and like for example, some historian, and if we ask them to write this, whatever history we have written in a story format, it would be very difficult for them because it requires both kind of capabilities. Like one is a scientific capability of writing it in an objective manner, and it requires a creative capability. We know that those two are like different parts of the brain. One is the analytical part of the brain, and one is the creative part of the brain. And we see that these great sages had the combination of both, because I do research, and when I write papers, I don't write it in story format or poetry format. It is very difficult for me to, like, somebody will tell me to write the entire paper in poetry format. It will be impossible because there will be no research happening then. But we see in these great sages, they had this capability of delivering facts with that poetic, creative mind. And that is greatness of our sages. So here we have to understand that there would be some some verses which would be metaphors, because that is the liberty that the sages have taken, but that is for a purpose. And hence we should, that's why Shubhani ji was mentioning that we should study this under a lineage under Guru, because Guru understands like the verse and the context around it to deliver the proper meaning of the metaphors, because metaphors can be sometimes very misleading, and it is, metaphors are rooted in culture and tradition. It is rooted in the time and the space. For example, today we use some metaphors like this is a piece of cake. When we use that kind of a metaphor, we don't literally mean that it is actually a piece of cake. We mean that it's easy, right? So that kind of phrases we always use, but the meaning of those phrases only can come out when we are in that particular time and in that particular region. For example, the piece of cake, the English language is existing for such a long period of time. This phrase of piece, it's a piece of cake, may not exist in future or may not have existed previously. It may be only relevant today. So this contextual information is also very important to understand the meaning of verses. It is also important where the verses are situated in the chapter, what is said before, what is said after. And that is why a lineage in which the guru is teaching and Shishya is getting the knowledge, that's an important lineage to get this knowledge. Taking this as the background of Itihasa, now the question arises like, how can you say for certain that Ramayana or Mahabharata happened? And then one thing we need to mind here is we should be careful, like there is nothing in science that is for certain. Science only deals in probabilities. It is said that science, the corridor of science is littered with the bodies of dead hypotheses. So in science, we hypothesize something and we prove or disprove the hypothesis. And that hypothesis may be disproved in the future with a new observation. So there is nothing called like this is for certain. In science, it only talks about probabilities, like this is highly probable or this is less likely probable. And that is why that kind of like demand of demanding this kind of a proof where you say for certain that Ramayana happened or not, it is impossible. Nobody can prove anything for that matter. And we'll see what. We'll see that as an example. So here we have 4 figures which are well known in history, whose historicity is never doubted. The first one is Hipparchus. He is a Greek astronomer who designed, who gave the idea of precession of equinoxes. Second one is Socrates. Third one is Jesus. And fourth one is Euclid, the father of mathematics. Nobody doubts their historicity. But it would be shocking for us to know that there is no archaeological evidence for any of these 4 figures. So if there is no archaeological evidence or any like hard evidence, how can one say that they existed? So here I am not implying, or nobody is implying that they did not existed. Here we are just implying that archaeological evidence or the demand of a hard archaeological evidence itself shouldn't be the criterion for the existence of these great personalities. And the second thing we should understand is, in our education system, we have been taught in such a way that we question our religions, but we don't question, like we don't use the same standards that we use for Western and for Eastern to see the existence of things. So here we did not ever question the historicities of these great figures. Even though the standards, if we use the same standard of criterion with which we are judging Ramayana or Mahabharata, if we apply those standards here, they would not be able to pass that standard. But again, we are not implying that they did not existed. We are just implying that the archaeological evidence has limitations. And it's only fortunate if we get some archaeological evidence, because archaeological evidence may disappear in time because of natural forces, which doesn't mean that these great figures did not existed. So we should keep that in mind. And then coming to what the evidences are there in Mahabharata or Ramayana. So typically in Mahabharata or Ramayana, the way scholars have gone about dating these 2 great epics is by looking at the astronomical observations, by oceanography evidence, archaeological evidence, paleontology, and other disciplinaries like study of the riverbeds, genetics, or botany, etc. So how do they go about doing it is, they use the astronomical observations mentioned in Ramayana and Mahabharata as the primary evidence for finding the time period in which these epics happened, the rough time period, and then they corroborate those evidence with the other evidences like oceanography, archaeology, paleontology, and other disciplines of science. Why do they do so? Because archaeology in itself cannot give us, for example, I'm just taking an example of archaeology in this case. Let's say we find we excavate something like a sword or something. The sword will not, on the sword it won't be written that this is Sri Rama's sword or this is Arjuna's sword. It won't be written like that, right? it has to be seen in context. Like the sword only makes sense when we carbon date that sword, and then we try to see in the history like what was there in those times, and we can try to find like, okay, some correlations in that, because sword in itself in isolation cannot prove anything, right? So that is how archaeology, oceanography works. They are just like corroborations to the historical events that happened, uh, that is mentioned in the history. So astronomy is much more reliable in that sense because the movements of stars is much more predictable, and then there are softwares which helps us back simulate the conditions of the positions of the stars. And that way, astronomical evidences becomes much more reliable than oceanography or archaeology, because those evidence are more dependent on the serendipity. It will depend on how lucky we are to find those evidence, because those evidence may not always be there. But stars have a longer time frame, and hence they are always there, and we can back simulate, and the movements are more predictable. So let's start with astronomical observations. So how do they go about doing it? Is these texts have mentions of seasons, months, eclipses. They also mention the observation of some comets or some constellations, and these researchers use some software, this astronomical software, which can help them back simulate these conditions, and they see that when were these conditions true, and that way they find out the relevant time period. So there are many such verses which are used as an astronomical observations. So what they try to do is they try to find a certain time period which agrees with maximum of those verses, because it happens that it has been seen that it's impossible to find a time period which agrees with all the verses, because it may happen that some verse may contradict. So they try to find a time period which verses with most of the verses, and that is how they go about finding the relevant time period in which these events might have happened. In this, there are again different researchers going about the dating problem differently. Some researchers use some verses as just pure astronomical observations, while other researchers treat those same verses as just a metaphor. So in that, it becomes a very interesting way, because it's not that easy. It shows that the difficulty of dating it's not a trivial problem to understand how one should go about dating these great epics. And that is why we should appreciate that difficulty and understand that these academic scholars, the very fact that these academic scholars are interested in dating it, is the proof that it existed, albeit it is not certain when it existed. So there is discussions around that, and that's a healthy aspect of it. We'll come to that aspect in some time. We'll see what happens when there are multiple dates which are suggested by multiple people. So for example, here we are taking one example. An example here is a researcher named Nilesh Oak. They try, like, his hypothesis is Arundhati. There is a shlok in Mahabharata which says Arundhati is walking ahead of Vasishtha. So Arundhati is a star in a constellation, and Vasishtha is a star in constellation. We know that all the stars revolve around the pole star in the night. As the night proceeds, the stars go in the clockwise direction around the pole star. In that, Arundhati and Vasishtha are this twin star system. So for some time period, it's looked like Arundhati is walking ahead of Vasishtha. That means Arundhati is going and Vasishtha is following in that circular format. And in some other time periods, it looks like Vasishtha is going forward and Arundhati is following. So there is a shlok in Mahabharata which says Arundhati is walking ahead of Vasishtha in this sense. So that leads them to this conclusion that this happens only in this particular time frame of 10,048, 1020, 10,248 BCE to 4,636 BCE. So that basically gives them a rough time period. And then they use other observations, there are other observations with seasons and months that they use to shorten this period, and they find a particular time period. I'm not going into detail of what those all observations are because that would take up some time, and we would require more detailed discussion for that. For that, I refer you to the video that basically was a source of my information. Like the researcher discusses much more detail. So that is how one goes about trying to use astronomical evidences to find a rough time period of these events. Here there is another example of Ramayana. So in Ramayana, one shlok basically says that now the Polaris is the pole star, but at that time, Brahma Rishi or Vega, as we call it in English, is a pole star, was the pole star. So this happens only in this particular time period of 14,000 BC to 10,000 BC, and that's due to the precision of equinoxes, and that requires some understanding of how the equinoxes works, how the precision of equinoxes works, and also some information about the Jyotish Shastra, or Jyotish as in astronomy, because now Jyotish we understand like trying to predict the future. That's not what Jyotish initially meant. Jyotish was trying to understand the movements of the stars. That was the astronomy. So they basically use this and other evidences, other shlokas from Valmiki Ramayana to understand that when this could have happened, when the actual Ramayana happened, and the suggested date by this particular researcher is around 12,209 BCE for Ramayana. So this becomes the astronomical observations, but then they try to also corroborate this findings with other evidences from other disciplines. For example, we know that in Mahabharata, Dwarka was submerged because of the rising of the oceans. So from the oceanography, we try to find when did this sudden rise in ocean happen. And then lo and behold, we find that in 8,000 or 7,000 years before present, this kind of ocean rise happened in this region and across the world. Actually, it happened. And that could be the reason that we read in Dwarka, in Mahabharata, that Dwarka was submerged after Sri Krishna departed, right? So these kind of evidences are then used as a corroboration for the astronomical evidences that we find in the previous, like in what we saw previously. Then we go to archaeological evidence. As we said, archaeological evidence in themselves are not conclusive, but they still show that there was some existing things in those times. For example, some painted graveware was found in the region of Kurukshetra, and those were dated back to 12,000 to 6,000 BCE. 600 BCE, sorry, 12,000 BCE to 600 BCE. Now it may seem like the previous date was mentioning like 5,000 BC and this date is like 12,000 BC. How are they? Like they're not, they don't agree with each other. There's no agreement here. So what's wrong with this? So archaeological evidence is limited because it's known that even after Mahabharata, people still use these painted gravewares. So when you archaeologically extract these or excavate these gravewares, they could be from those periods as well. So it may not necessarily be from Mahabharata period. So we cannot go and directly conclude that Mahabharata happened in 1200 to 600 BC. This is only as a corroborative evidence we use. Another evidence shows that we excavate this kind of chariots. Here we see one wheel of the chariot and the second wheel of the chariot is here. So these kind of chariots are dated back to 4,000 years old with the help of carbon dating. And these are again corroborative evidences. They kind of corroborate what findings that we have in the astronomical observations. So that is how these evidences should be used. So ASI, which is the primary body of for conducting archaeology, is Archaeological Survey of India. They basically say that the Mahabharata could have dated back to 1500 to 2000 BC. Again, this doesn't match the astronomical observation, which is either 5500 BC or 3000 BC, but it should be brought into mind that chariots were not they did not extinct after the Mahabharata. People still use chariot, and the one that is excavated could be from that period. So that doesn't mean that the astronomical observations were incorrect and this should be the correct one. In fact, those evidences are much more reliable than this evidence, if you look from that point of view. So that's why these evidences can only be used as a corroboration. And lastly, there was this marine archaeology, which was carried out, which was also very groundbreaking, because it also proved the existence of Dwarka, which was submerged. And there was like pottery and like submerged potteries and seals, which were dating back to around 3500 BCE, which somewhat matches with the astronomical observations as well. So these kind of evidences are there, which proves that there was existence of the such kind of epic, albeit the timing is not certain, and the research is still on, and that's a good and scientific outlook towards these things, rather than just dismissing it as completely mythology. Because to prove that it's mythology, you have to give evidence. What's the evidence of it's mythology? It's not a scientific statement to make that these all are myths. Scientifically, if you want to go from fact-based science, then it has to be we have to come to this conclusion that these things happen. The timing is debatable, and that's a good debate to have, because that leads to discussion and that leads to truth. And again, archaeological evidence have been found for Ram Setu, which is pretty well known. Even NASA was able to, with the help of satellite pictures, were able to see that it still exists underwater. Although the dating and the age of this is debatable. Some researchers say it's 18,000 years old. Some researchers say that it's only 3,500 to 4,000 years old. So the research is still on. But then what we require is an open mind. It's not like we just take a close-minded point of view of this all are myths. Why are we even doing this? That's not the way science works, and that shouldn't be the way science works. Then we go to paleontology. Like for example, in Ramayana, in Valmiki Ramayana, there are in Ayodhya Kand some shloks which mentioned the existence of elephants with 3 or 4 tusks. And in paleontology, we do find such animals existed around 13,000 years back, and they were called Gomorphotheres. So these kind of evidence corroborate the findings of Valmiki and can be used. So gives more certainty. Like that's what we talked about in the start. Like this makes the claim of Ramayana happening in that particular time period becomes more probable, and that's how science works. And then we also have different evidences. Here I am not discussing those evidence. Like for example, in genetics, there is evidence, like they try to see. This is a very interesting thing that I read. In genetics, what they do is, with the help of genetics, you can see the genetic diversity. So you can see male genetic diversity and female genetic diversity, because those are dependent. Like male is dependent on chromosome Y, which is not there in female. So you can actually discriminate between these two diversities. And after a great war like Mahabharata, which led to so many, like one particular gender was almost died because of the war. So there has to be genetic diversity. In the male should go down, and in the female should go up. Like not the female will remain constant and the male will go down, right? So the ratio of the genetic diversity of male is to female should go up, right? And that is what they actually find, that this happened around 7,000 years back in the region of Southeast Asia, like where India is situated. So that kind of evidences corroborate the happening of such a great epic war. So again, genetics, botany is also used. For example, what happened was when Ramayana, when Ram and Lakshman were going with Vishwamitra in the Gurukul. So in Gurukul and on the not the pilgrimage, but as they were going around, Vishwamitra ji used to tell them about the usage of some botanical flowers, the Ayurvedic usage, or what do they stand for and how they can be useful. And those all are very well documented in Valmiki Ramayana. So now we use botany to understand that whether such things existed in those times. So again, those are all corroborative evidences, and those gives more probability to these events happening. So coming to multiple proposed dates for these events. So here we see that for Mahabharat, whereas like 5561 BCE, some researchers say that it's 3000 BCE. Generally, these are the two most common dates which are debatable. And the debate happens because as these verses are in Sanskrit, they could be taken as metaphors, they could be taken as an actual astronomical observations, and that is why these differences come about. And therefore, a healthy discussion around it is a good sign because it leads to scientific finding of scientific truth. The very fact that so many researchers are interested in dating, so many scholars are interested in dating Ramayana and Mahabharata shows that they did happen. The only question is when. And there are some proposals out there. Now we need to validate which proposal is most likely and which proposal is lesser likely. And that's how science works. And same thing holds for Ramayana. Like one researcher says it's 12,000 BCE, one says 5,000, one says 7,000. So there are some differences. Therefore, a debate, for example, there is one video which actually does debate this out, where the debate between 5,500 and 3,000 happens. And that debate is interesting to watch if somebody is interested in this topic, where they try to corroborate each other's evidence and they try to see how the others corroborate and also cut down others' evidence. And that kind of debate is good debate because that leads to truth, because that leads to discussion and that leads to truth. Yeah. So this is the primary evidences that we have. But it's interesting to see how sometimes we just use a Western framework because we are educated in that kind of format. We are educated in Western style. So we don't question those figures in West, but we question our figures using the same. We don't use the same standard of criterion for both West and the East to determine what is true and what is not. But that shouldn't be the case. So that somewhere leads to, that is where this topic became important about Hinduism and about understanding our own identity and our own culture, because we are not aware of these things, and then we end up believing whatever we are said, and that shouldn't be the case. I'll just stop sharing. We can discuss, like, that's all I had.
Okay, so thank you, Akash, for doing all this research and presenting to us. So I think this was a very important topic for us to really think about, especially also because a lot of our children ask us, did this really happen? Is it true? You know, some of our children read these books and study these books, and we also don't know how to address that and answer their questions. So I think the first thing we need to do is understand it ourselves.